And what's interesting is what we see with people who have bone stress injuries. When they're dealing with an injury, they think, well, I'm not training, so therefore I'm not going to eat as much. Well, your body's trying to repair, so it's even more important that you then eat sufficiently. You're running in straight lines. Bones cells will switch off after about 100 cycles of loading. That's, taking 160, 70 steps per minute. So pretty quickly they get bored. If you look out there, the perception is, oh, you don't want to be lifting weights as you're getting older. It's the opposite.
Purely as a physio, with your physio hat on, would you recommend Super Shoes? We have a quick favour to ask you. Each week, we want to make this podcast better and better. But to do that, we need your help. If you're watching on YouTube, could you spare us 1 second and click that subscribe button? And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please follow us and rate the show. It will really, really help us to keep bringing you these conversations each week to get you out on those runs and help you hit your running goals. Thank you. Welcome back to 5 Miles Easy. On the show today, we are back with running physio Aidan O'Flaherty. Aidan needs very little introduction as this will be his 4th time on the show, but he's a specialist running physio and mine and Steph's strength and conditioning coach.
If you want to listen to Aidan's previous episodes, we have covered strength training for runners, injuries, and the importance of recovery. And today we're going to ask Aidan all the questions we've always wanted to ask a physio.
Steph, I don't know about you, but there are those certain things that I've always done with training or in the gym that I know are good, but I've never actually understood the science. And Aidan's really good at going into the science and the reason behind doing things, which is why I like working with him so much, because I find to motivate me to keep on top of my strength and conditioning, I have to know why I'm doing the exercises. But I think it's going to be so interesting to share that today and actually delve into some of the things that we still don't understand.
I completely agree with you in working with Aidan, and I think him having the combination of being both a physio and a strength coach really helps. When we're strength training, him understanding why you have to do the certain exercises. And I have to say, since working with Aidan probably over the last year, I've learned so much more about the science of what I'm doing than I ever knew before. So I think it's just so important. And like you say, it's hugely motivating. Another thing I find interesting is I think when you're injured, as you have obviously been over the last few months, is you learn so much more about your body as well. So I can imagine you've definitely understood what's going on way more than you did.
Yeah, 100%. And that's actually really helped the process, understanding what my body needs to heal. And I think having that knowledge has allowed me to be a bit more patient. I'm not going to say patient because I don't think I've quite achieved that, but more patient than otherwise.
No, I think you have been, because I think when someone says, okay, hold off running for a couple more weeks because X, Y, Z, at least then you've got the reasons why, rather than saying, no, you can't run for another 2 weeks. I think that's a lot harder.
Yeah, exactly.
Should we hear from Aidan then?
Let's do it. Aidan, thanks so much for coming on the pod for the 4th time back again in the hot seat. Today we've already covered, what have we covered so far? We've done strength and conditioning, the importance of strength and conditioning, injuries, rehab, and today we are asking you all the questions we've always wanted to ask a physio. So all of those things that Steph and I were talking, and there are lots of things we do and we've done in our training for a while, but then when we think about it, it's like, hang on, how does that actually work? So we're hoping to get those answers from you today. A few of our listeners have also sent in questions, so we will be picking your brains on those too.
Sounds good. I'll do my best to answer those questions, and I'll also put some questions back to you guys in terms of like how you use it in your training, because as a physio, yes, I can give knowledge, but the athlete's knowledge is equally as important.
Sounds good. So to kick off, one topic that has been hot on my list for a while is bone stress injuries. Now, I find this fascinating because one thing we've been working on a lot is obviously rehab, but you've really explained to me how the rehab is working, how it's strengthening my bone, repairing the stress fracture, and also hopefully preventing further injuries. And I found delving into the science of that super interesting. So I'd love to share that today on the pod. So to kick off, what actually causes a bone stress injury? Because I'm fascinated by how we can actually fracture a bone just by running on it.
Yeah, it really is interesting. And it's one of those injuries, as you are well aware of, it's incredibly frustrating because it involves long periods of recovery. Ultimately, a bone stress injury will occur due to a workload error or a training error, if you like. Now, there's lots of things that can contribute to that. And I wanted to think of an analogy of how I can explain this so people can really kind of relate to it. So if you think of your bones, right? And then think of a road, and you've got traffic going over a road. Over time, you get little cracks in the road, in the pavement, and then workers will come along, they'll repair the cracks, and you continue using it. Now, let's say that traffic increases by 2 or 3 times. All of a sudden, these cracks are getting bigger, develops into, let's say, a pothole, and the workers can't repair it, and then it becomes unsafe to use. So bones are quite similar. When we exercise, we have, rather than wear and tear, it's wear and repair. Now, if we increase our intensity too quickly, what happens is we create more wear on the bone, and therefore those micro cracks in the bone become bigger. And what happens is the fatigue of that bone is reduced. So it takes less cycles of loading as the bone gets weaker in order for it to then eventually develop into a fracture. So normally it would about 3 to 4 weeks after a workload error is when you'll start to experience those symptoms. It's never just down to one. It's accumulation of that load over time.
Are there ever sort of warning signs that the little cracks are at risk of developing into a full crack? Because from my experience, when I had a stress fracture, the first time I felt pain was when it was like a full-blown stress fracture. I didn't know anything was wrong until that moment.
It's such a good point, because some people, I've experienced it before with athletes coming into me, where you image them and you might be suspicious, but they've got a significant fracture depending on their pain tolerance. Some people have a lower pain threshold, some people have more. Also, the location could be linked to that as well. But there is signs that we do want to be looking out for, and that is if you're getting pain that is not going away within 24 hours, the pain is lasting, you're having to change your gait when you're running, and then also when you're starting to get pain at rest. So stiffness is a key thing. So if we look at one of the common areas that we get in the shin, start to get a bit of stiffness and soreness in the shin. It might present like pain in the calf, but it's when it's not reacting like you would expect a muscle to react, i.e. with a bit of reduced load, it's going away. But when it comes to bones, pain-free exercise is a key golden rule. Whereas with a muscle and tendon, we can get away with working to a little bit of discomfort, providing it's settling. So be mindful of pain that's lasting after you train, pain that gets worse, and also pain that is there at rest. And particularly sometimes people might experience it at night as well. Have you ever can you remember, if you look back to, this is for either of you, when you look back to your stress fractures, in hindsight now, when you look back, is there any kind of warning signs that, cropped up for you?
The only thing that I could think of in hindsight, so it happened after my first marathon. In hindsight, I must have had the injury during the marathon, but the stress fracture came a month or 2 after the marathon.
Yeah.
And the thing that I noticed, if I looked back, was I was super fit, and then that started going down as the marathon came around. So I was like, okay, maybe my body's like trying to protect me.
Yes.
But I didn't know that at the time.
You learned from it, right?
Yeah. But there was no pain. That's what was weird.
Yeah. Frustrating when you look back at it.
Yeah, it is really, when I had mine, I was convinced it was hip flexor inflammation.
Yep.
And it did really, that was the strange thing. It actually presented very much like a muscle injury. But I think the red flag for me was, as you say, when it didn't settle down, and with lots of exercises and things that would normally help tendons and sort it out within a week or so, it just wasn't getting better.
Yeah, it's such a good point, because as training hours increase, so does the increased risk of a bone stress injury. So if you have a runner that's running, say, 4 hours a week, for every hour that they increase, the risk of a bone stress injury will go up. So, both of you being elite and high level athletes, you're training, more than 10, 12 hours a week. So naturally, that's going to increase the risk factor. It's just balancing your training load, running faster and on the days you choose, and making sure we're recovering and fueling, etc., which I'm sure we'll come on to.
And then so once you've got the fracture and it's a fracture and you're resting, how does the bone heal? What's happening in the bone to...
Great
repair
point.
itself?
Yeah, great question. So we have these two, what we refer to as osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So osteoclasts, they come in and they clear out damaged bone. Now, this is a normal cycle. It's happening all year round. But that can take about 4 weeks for them to absorb, those osteoclasts to absorb that damaged bone. But the interesting thing, the osteoblasts, they come along and they lay down new bone, but that can take up to months, even up to a year. So if you think about that continuous cycle where we have remodeling of the bone, if someone has a workload error, i.e. they increase their training intensity too quickly, well then that's massively going to increase the risk of injury. So you're resting, the bone is naturally repairing, providing you're getting the nutrients. So another analogy I thought up of is if you're building a wall, think of the wall as being, you're building your bones. If you're adding like cement and bricks, that's what's going to keep it together. So things like vitamin D, vitamin C, they're, one is the bricks, one is the cement. We need certain macronutrients to create a stronger bone. And the key thing is, of course, fuel, i.e. kind of carbohydrates being one of the main ones that helps. And what's interesting is what we see with people who have bone stress injuries is when they're dealing with an injury, they think, well, I'm not training, so therefore I'm not going to eat as much. Well, your body's trying to repair. So it's even more important that you then eat sufficiently.
So do you want to, with the osteoclasts and osteoblasts,
Yeah.
do you want to have more osteoblasts to repair the bone? Is that how it works? Or can you get more?
Great question. So when we refer to, our bones are mechanosensitive. So they respond to loading. All right. So we have what we call stress and strain. So when and Rose, we've just finished in the gym, right? So what we were doing in the gym was doing exercises that create bone adaptation, right? So i.e. jumping lateral type movements. Now this will depend on what bone you've injured as well. So for you, Rose, looking at the hip, we're doing multi-directional loading. That is high force, i.e. high muscle contraction, which creates a greater strain and deformation of the bone. What that's going to do, exactly to your point, it's going to create those osteoblasts and trying to create new bone. But then what we need to consider is that bone mechanosensitivity, after we load it, bones essentially go deaf. They become bored of certain activity. Running, for example, if you're running in straight lines, bones cells will switch off after about 100 cycles of loading. That's taking 160, 70 steps per minute. So pretty quickly they get bored. Now this is where it's important, where multi-directional exercise comes in. So when someone's coming back from a stress fracture under guidance of a professional at the right time, you can do those exercises twice a day, multiple days a week. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is create new bone. But it's only going to work if you're getting sufficient sleep and you're eating sufficiently, because if you do that to a runner who let's say might have a history of disordered eating, they're not fueling enough, you're just going to dig them into a deeper hole.
And importantly, you mentioned about the bones getting bored. So you always said do those exercises. You've told me to do those exercises either before I ran or after 6 hours. So run 6 hours, then do the exercises. Otherwise, yes, I'm not getting the same benefit.
Exactly. And it's one of those where it's debatable, but from the research I've been reading, you look around like Stuart Warden and Rich Willie and the work that these guys have done. Most runners will run and then they'll go into the gym and they'll strength train. But bone cells are essentially going to be switched off and we're not going to get that bone adaptation that we're after. So ultimately, yes, we would want to have, minimum kind of 6 hours for the mechanosensitivity of that bone to return.
So is that the most effective way to heal a bone, those multi-directional movements and the high impact activities?
Ultimately, yes. So if you're looking at, great question. So if you're looking at trying to create new bone, right? You're looking, for example, if you think of a back squat, right? That's not really going to load the shin massively. Yes, it's going to load massively around the hip and pelvis. So it's going to be beneficial for that. Whereas if we're trying to target the shin or a bone in the foot, we might look at calf raises or plyometric type movements, multi-directional. So another great point to bring up here as we're chatting about it is when you're at a younger age, i.e. you're a teenager and you're going through puberty, that's where your bones are going to be really susceptible to loading. So we see people who play racket sports, their forearm, the bone density is much stronger in their forearm than it is in the opposite arm. Same thing with people who play volleyball and multi-directional sports. They're going to have stronger bones. And if you have a young athlete who is specializing in endurance sports at a young age, then the chances are they're going to likely have poor bone health. So it's really important for a younger athlete. So if you're a coach listening, or your mum, or another kid that's doing lots of running at an early age, it's just always important to make sure that you include other sports, because that's going to help with the overall health of your bone longer term.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And what about, so when the bone is fully healed, is it back to the strength that it was pre-fracture, or is there a higher risk that you could refracture the same area?
Yeah, so I always put a positive spin to this, and the biggest risk factor for bone stress injury is a history of a bone stress injury. So if you've had one, the chances of it and you having another one goes up quite significantly. However, if you look at the bigger picture and you identify if there's any, for example, any changes in menstrual cycle or suppression of certain hormones, and you identify that and you address it. Let's say your vitamin D levels are low. Here in the UK now, we don't tend to get sunlight from September to April these days.
Depressing.
Exactly. So it goes up exponentially. The more you have, the more you're likely to get in the future. But if you address those bigger pictures, you take that risk down. So the key thing is working with someone who knows the area well, and including a multidisciplinary team. So, for example, Rose, sports doctor involved. We've got, previous DEXAs, everything. So we know with Rose, everything is normal. It was just looking back at it. It was just down to training for a big event, feeling really fit and strong, and, trying to push those boundaries. It was purely down to the volume. Whereas I might see another athlete and you look and you think, okay, they've got an element of previous disordered eating. They're maybe a bit obsessive about their running. For that person, you need to address those. Otherwise, the risk is going to be quite higher for it coming back. Now, in terms of is the bone fully healed, when you're looking at in terms of healing, it can take bone density to go back to its normal state from, let's say, 3 to 6 months, sometimes even to a year. And often, if we compare, so there's a great study by a lady called Kirsten Popp, who was looking at tibial stress fractures in female athletes. And within 12 months, often they picked up another injury. I think there was something like 10 out of the 30 athletes or 12 out of 30 athletes sustained a second bone stress injury, and often it was in the opposite leg. But these, if you look at it, they came back relatively quickly, pushing at 3 months, increasing their intensity, whereas we know at 3 months your bone density is perhaps maybe at its weakest, and that's where people would normally resume a run walk and just slowly build up. So it's just patience within that first 3 to 6 months, and then if you do that, the risk of it coming back and you address the bigger picture is hopefully going to be significantly lower.
And how do shoes play into all of this in terms of injury prevention and also coming back from an injury? Because now we've got these super shoes that have loads of foam and cushioning, and then plates that propel us forward and absorb a lot of that impact, which logically you think is probably good for injury prevention because we're having so much less impact. But we had an interesting discussion the other day around the fact that those shoes also allow you to do more because your legs don't get so tired. So what's your view on whether the shoes help or hinder? And I guess what is the right balance?
Yeah, it's a typical it depends answer, right? But you're absolutely right. If we look at the marathon times and how faster that they're getting, the female marathon 2:09 now, right? And the men's we're looking at 2:01, something like that. So we're seeing people are able to accumulate much more mileage per week. And to your point is that one of those reasons is that people experience less soreness. So you're starting to see people doing double threshold days now, right? So if you look at people doing double threshold days, they're wearing these super shoes, carbon plate or high stack shoes, getting less soreness, but they're running faster. Remember, magnitude of loading, as you run faster, bone strain is higher because the muscles are contracting to push you forward at a quicker rate. So you might have less soreness in the muscle because you're running more, you're expending more energy, therefore you're burning more calories. So it's very difficult then when you start going to those high mileage to be able to fuel, because we can only feed ourselves with so much. But it's important then to consider if your mileage is up, that also your energy intake must match that, because you're going to end up in low energy availability, or what we refer to as LEA, which prolonged period you're in that, you're going to end up in, energy deficiency or relative energy deficiency. So I do think it plays a key role. Getting the balance is going to be different from, for example, Rose, from you to Steph. If we look at our training capacity and our skeletal health, let's say your bucket might be bigger than someone else's bucket. It really comes down to looking at what you've done previously, what kind of injuries you've had, how much mileage you were doing. So it is a difficult one to balance. But what I would say to someone is try not to be too dependent on these shoes. I'm guilty of this. I love, high stack shoes, takes soreness away from the calf. I can run a little bit more. And I know then if I kick my mileage up that the risk of injury is going to come on. So it's good to have an alternative shoe that's, say, less cushion, but just making those changes very gradually.
We're the co-founders of Boldly, a movement created to make running safer, stronger, and more connected, especially when it gets dark.
Did you know that 72% of women change how or when they exercise during winter due to safety concerns?
All three of us know what it's like to avoid dark routes, cut runs short, or skip runs altogether because we don't feel safe at this time of year.
Boldly is here to change that. From social runs to useful tools, Boldly is here to connect runners, make running safer all year round, and reclaim spaces that we lose.
Join us every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. for our weekly social run in Putney. It's women-led, but open to everyone, and all paces are welcome, so no one gets left behind.
And for even more connection, join our WhatsApp community. It's a space to chat, share tips, and meet more like-minded runners.
Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Boldly Run for details.
And sign up to boldlyrun.com for updates on our app, which is launching soon.
Because together, we can run safely.
Together, we run boldly.
So as a runner, you see the advantages, but purely as a physio, putting your physio hat on, would you recommend super shoes? Do you like them from a physio perspective?
I love them, right? Just for me as a runner, I love them. But from a physio perspective, I think it's try to use them sensibly, conservatively for those maybe key sessions that you might want to do. But for other mileage, like easy running mileage, you don't need to be in carbon plated shoes. And let's be honest, we are seeing this more now. We're seeing people going around wearing, Puma Nitro 3s, which are a great shoe, where Alpha Flies when they're running easy, and it's not really necessary. It's not necessary.
Yeah, but why is that? Because if you say that you can recover faster from these super shoes, then why don't we just wear them for every run?
So I feel it comes down again to the energy, right, that you're expending, but also what are we often doing when we're wearing super shoes? We're running faster. Yeah, so it's a great point, and I've been thinking about this as well. And there's a few people I'd love to question on this, because what we're hearing is that it reduces muscle soreness. So you would think that it reduces the amount of workload on the muscle. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act. But what we do see is that they'll reduce the workload at the calf and ankle. All right. So if you're in a super shoe versus a spike shoe on the track, or you've got a lower heel toe drop, your calves are going to feel it the next day.
But is it then going to be, are our ankles and calves going to be weaker because we're not working them?
Potentially. So that load has to go elsewhere. So that load mainly will transition towards the knee and the hip. So it's being mindful then that we're taking load away from one area, is just going to put it elsewhere. So to answer your question, if you're not doing specific strength training, then the likelihood is yes, you're going to likely decondition certain areas.
Interesting. And another question that we had, which was I think a few people asked this, was when it comes to stretching and warming up before a run. So I guess the first one is, for an easy or steady run where you're not working super hard, is it important to stretch or warm up before that run?
Yeah, think about it. Think about stretching and warming up, right? How do we warm up is we increase blood flow to the muscles. What increases blood flow to the muscles is as your heart rate goes up, it pumps blood out. So if you think about you're sitting at home, you're relaxed, you're stretching on the floor, you're not increasing your heart rate. You're not pushing blood to the muscle. You're not increasing your metabolic activity. If you start off with a brisk walk or or let's say you're jogging on the spot, that's going to warm you up, because the action of running is what actually creates our body to warm up. So for an easy run, personally, I would say stretch if you want to, not because you have to. Maybe do more of a dynamic type stretch where you're moving, but ultimately I would say just start slow and build in. I think nowadays there's so many different things that are being sold to people through social media, and where running is so simplistic, you just need a pair of running shoes, go out, enjoy for what it is. All of a sudden now, and there's pros and cons, we've got all of these extra things that are being chucked at us, and it's, foam rollers, massage guns, compression socks, all of these other, dare I mention freeze roll, all these other things that are coming to us that people feel like they need when they start running. Whereas actually, if you look back, 20, 30, 40 years ago, all they had was a pair of shoes.
Yeah, and finding what works for you and makes you feel good. Because one of the things that I know I now need to do to feel good, even just on an easy run in the morning, is I'll take my dog for a walk first thing. And actually, I notice the difference between if I've just sat down, not moved, and then go for a run versus going out for a nice walk before. It just kind of gets my legs, warmed up before the run.
Do you know, such a good point, because who am I to tell someone if an athlete comes into me and they're dealing with something and they tell me that, when they do this before they run, they feel amazing. I'm not going to turn around and say, stop doing it. If it works for you, it works for you, great. But I think where the issue might come in sometimes, if they perceive that that's going to actually, let's say, help them not get injured, or it is let's say, if you look at like the pyramid of what we know works for injury reduction, your sleep, your downtime, your fueling. But if they pay such a high value to something that we know isn't necessarily backed up in the research, then I might maybe challenge their beliefs a little bit and ask them questions, or maybe help educate them around it. But it comes back to that again. If it's really working for them, then, and I'm starting to see this more now that I'm getting more specific with my training. There's a few things I like doing before I go out that perhaps maybe I wouldn't have done before.
One thing I really like doing is a little circuit with resistance bands, because I just feel like it gets those muscles activating and will keep my form good. But is that real, or is that one of those things that's like a 0.001% but makes me feel good?
Yeah, I think so. When you look at that term activation, switching muscles on, people often will come into me and say, one of the most common things I hear is, oh yeah, my glutes don't fire. If you're walking, you're upright, you can be sure your glutes are working. But we do see if someone has pain and they have a chronic injury or a history of injuries in a certain area, then we can see that muscle function might not be as good, or the rate of force of that muscle contracting might not be as good. So therefore, doing some of these exercises, I think, can definitely help. And I like doing, like yourself, I love getting the band out, my side steps, hip flexion. For me, it feels like when I go out running that, okay, I have, and I'm using the term that I said I shouldn't use, is switch on. But I feel like that, I just feel, I'd say more kind of strong, held together. But again, I think that's just purely down to my perception rather than it truly making those changes in terms of your glutes are going to fire more. But again, if it makes you feel good, particularly during sessions, you do your strides, you do your plyometric work. I think that's slightly different than when you're running easy.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense as well, because it means the first step when you're running isn't the first time you've used that muscle in the day. If you know what I mean, if you've done something before it, it's like you're kind of used to using it already before the run. Yeah,
and then I agree with it. Then if we say, right, if I said to you, Steph, you have certain exercises that you do before you run or you rows, and then we say, okay, for 6 weeks, let's not do it. Be interesting to see how you perceive. Maybe after 6 weeks of not doing something, you might feel, okay, I don't need it. So is it down to a habit, a pattern, something that you have been doing for a while? It might not be, but it'd be something interesting for you maybe to try and see if that changes.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because I probably started doing that, I don't know, a year ago. Before that, I never thought about it. And I obviously ran fine. So yeah, I do think it's probably a bit psychosomatic, and it also makes me think about that muscle a bit more. So if I've used my glutes, I sort of think about using my glutes a bit more. What about form? Is there such a lot of people will watch, the Kenyans run and be like, oh, it's such great form. But is there actually such thing as like the perfect running form that we should all be aiming for? Or is it individual because all our bodies are built individually?
Yes, if you look at, my build versus someone else. I might have longer femur, longer legs. I do have a short torso. My legs, when I sit here, I feel really small, even compared to you, but my legs are quite long. So naturally, we are going to have variabilities when it comes to running and running form. I mean, if you look at the London Marathon and you're standing on Tower Bridge and you watch the runners come past, if there is going to be a perfect running form, you would expect to see a high percentage of people running the same way. But even in the elite field, and I've done this for the past 3 years in a row. I've gone to Tower Bridge. I've recorded the elite men and women as they run past in slow motion. And I use it to highlight the difference in form, even from the person first place versus the person in, say, second, third, fourth, or the top 10. You're going to get a lot of variation. So if you look at, Gabriel Selassie, the old guy, previous one of the greatest runners, and you look at the amount of navicular drop or pronation that he has versus Kipchoge, we all have variations. In terms of foot strike, most runners between 80 that will go up closer to 90 the longer they run will be rear foot, i.e. heel strike. We've got midfoot and then more forefoot. So we do see lots of variations. The faster you're running, i.e. if you're on the track doing 1500 meter, Georgia Bell, you've had her on before, you see her, because they're running faster, they're naturally going to be more forefoot. So there is no one correct way to answer the question, but I do feel that perhaps maybe there is one way for you as an individual. Having spent, nearly a month in Kenya watching these people train, it is amazing when you watch them because they've just got long shins, long femurs. I think they do have a longer stride length naturally, but you also see them with some kind of weird arm swings, and there is a lot of variation. So I think when it comes to running form, it's just take it with a pinch of salt of what you might see online.
Does that naturally change as well? So you being a big advocate for strength training to help your running, of course, how does that help your efficiency of running? Would it naturally change your form as you get stronger?
It's a great question, Steph, because most people would say, for example, if someone has pelvic drop, which means as you're running, as you strike the ground, you see your hip kind of dip a little bit. So most people will say, oh, you need to strengthen your glutes. You have weak glutes. We've seen this in the research where they've tested and they've put runners on a progressive hip strengthening plan. They'll improve it by 30%. Their running form stays the same. So when we get people to strength train, naturally you would expect it might change the running form, but that's not actually what we see. To change running form, it's more on cues. So if someone says to you, or I want you to be more of a midfoot strike, you're going to think strike the ground below the knee, run a little bit softer. When you hit the ground, keep that hip up. So it's more running cues tend to be more effective at changing running form than strength training alone. Now, strength training will improve tissue capacity, resilience. So if someone has, let's say, an overstride or a significant pronation or navicular drop, then let's say like your tib post tendon, that tendon on the inside of the ankle, we often see people with that navicular drop or pronation, they might get a bit sensitive, but if you're strength training, it's going to make it more resilient. Therefore, you may not pick up an injury there.
That's so interesting. Is there any times when you would suggest that people try to change their form, particularly if it is something that you have to change whilst running? That's a very kind of conscious thing. So is that a good thing to do?
Yeah, so I would often do it when I'm trying to reduce load on sensitive areas. So let's say someone has pain in their knee. We see some great research by increasing running cadence, which is the amount of steps you take per minute. If we increase that from anything from 5 to 10%, we can see significant reductions in load placed on the knee. And often that results in less pain. Now, to your point, if I tell someone, all right, I want you to go from 160 steps per minute to 170, you're thinking about that when you're running, it becomes, it can be a bit overwhelming. You can get frustrated. There's a great researcher, Irene Davis, who's done a lot of work in this area. Well, she will normally say, give it kind of 8 sessions for you to feel like you've made a change. When I'm prescribing this to a runner, I might give them maybe 1 or 2 cues, such as using a metronome, for example, on your watch. I want you to think about doing that 4 times throughout the run for 1 minute. And then gradually over the next, say, month, we'll increase that. And then it's kind of like behavioral change, right? We're trying to change a habit. So the longer we stick to it, the longer we give them to make that change. It's like, if I like chocolate, if I want to stop eating chocolate, if I stop it completely, I'll get frustrated. If I slowly take it down, and might more likely to stick to it over the longer term.
So the more you do it, it just becomes subconscious.
It becomes more natural, yes. And I think when it comes to, back to the question again, is cadence, increasing cadence, particularly for bone stress injuries, we see it can be quite useful. So for example, if you look at the tibia, which is, or the foot, one of the more common areas that we'll see, if we increase your step rate, we reduce the amount of force per stride. We reduce that amount of strain on the bone. So that can be quite useful over a long period at reducing the risk of it coming back.
Is there a cadence that you'd recommend for everyone? My cadence is high, but I assume that's because I've got short legs.
Exactly. Most people will refer to the magic number 180. There is no magic number. I think I would say like 170 plus for easy running. Again, it really does depend on the individual. But I think what we see with adolescent collegiate athletes over in the States, there's a really good study. I think it was below 154. 154 steps per minute, there was a significant increase in bone stress injury rates versus those who had a higher cadence. So if someone comes in to me and they're just looking for me to have an overall look at their training load, their strength, their running gait, if there's nothing wrong, the only thing that I might change, if they've got a really, really low number and if they're looking to increase their volume, I might say, okay, let's potentially modify this to hopefully reduce any risk in the future.
That's so fascinating. I feel like running gait analysis are everywhere and everyone thinks, okay, I've got to go and get one to like correct my form. But it sounds like actually most of the time we probably don't need to be doing that.
No, you don't.
What about tissue adaptation? So we've talked about strengthening bones and how to heal bones, but what about tendon injuries or muscle tears? How does that work in terms of the healing process? And also, if we haven't got an injury, strengthening them to make us better at running.
Yeah, so if you look at muscle, it's got a good blood supply, so it tends to adapt, that little bit quicker. Tendons, you look at the color of tendons, they have a poor blood supply, similar to bones, depending on the type of bone as well. So tendons can take longer to adapt. And this is, if we look at the most classic injury that we'll see in a tendon is, say, an Achilles tendinopathy. People will often strength train for maybe 6 weeks, get frustrated because they don't see the benefits, and then they'll stop. It does take longer than that. You're looking at kind of up to 3 months plus to get those changes within the tendon structure, sometimes even longer. And it also requires high strain rates. So think of a calf raise from the floor and you're trying to get a strong Achilles tendon, I need to lengthen that tendon more, i.e. go into full dorsiflexion or do it off a step, or I drop that heel down, because that's going to create greater strain, greater deformation to that tendon, stimulating more adaptation. Now, we can do all of this strength training, but unless we're getting adequate fueling, it's not going to help it adapt. So to come back to the point earlier about low energy, if we're only taking a certain amount of fuel and we're not, let's say we're expending X amount of calories, but the calories we're taking in are lower, i.e. we're in a calorie deficit. Our body's going to prioritize that calories for our vital organs, i.e. the brain, the heart, and other organs. And then what gets left is your tissues, i.e. your tendons, your bones, your muscles. So it's really important with strength training that we're equally fueling for that. So we need variation, I think, in movement as well, and higher loads. People often think, well, running is, it's an endurance sport. I need lower loads and higher repetitions, whereas it's actually the opposite. We want to see higher loads, fewer repetitions, working to a higher percentage of your 1 rep max. That's what's going to help create that adaptation to the structure, progressively loading it.
How does that differ from building strength versus building muscle as well? So if you need to fuel sufficiently to just get stronger, then what's different about building muscle, or is it the same thing?
Yeah, great point. So one of the main reasons I would find, you tell me if you see this yourselves, a lot of people will try to avoid strength training for running because they don't want to put on bulk. They might feel it might slow them down. If you do lots of volume, so if you look at a given week, lots of sets, lots of repetitions, and you're eating a lot, that's going to create muscle hypertrophy. Now, if you look at some of the great research I've mentioned before, Rich Blagrove, another guy, Chris Beattie, Rich has done a great review on strength training, and they find that those ones that are specific to running we don't see any increase in muscle mass or muscle size. We see increases in force production, which is what we want. So when you're lifting for fewer reps, higher loads, and Chris Beattie did a study in Ireland, I think it was back in 2020, and they looked over 40-week period, 20 weeks, and then 20-week preseason, 20-week in-season, over 40 weeks, and didn't see any increase in muscle size. But what they did see was significant improvements in muscle force production, improvements in your running speed, your velocity at your VO2 max, increase in jump height, which is, as a runner, they're all desirable things that we want.
So it's actually the other way around to what most people think. It's the low weight, high reps, which will build the muscle, versus the high weight, low reps, which will make you strong but not build muscle, which is completely opposite to what a lot of people
Complete
think,
opposite, absolutely. No, if you're lifting, you're absolutely right. But with muscle hypertrophy, you need to be doing it, and this is a good thing for runners. You need to be doing it quite.
What is muscle
hypertrophy? Is increasing ultimately muscle size.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes that's desirable. So if you've had a bone stress injury, you're going to have a reduction in muscle mass around the area. So we need to build that up. So Rose, when we started working, we were lifting lower loads for more repetitions. Now we've kind of worked our way down. So sometimes it might be desirable. If you've been in a boot for 4 or 5 weeks, you might want to increase muscle size. But generally speaking, for a runner, yes, it's the opposite to what most people think.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, though, of not being scared of getting bigger muscles, because it can make you faster. It's not going to necessarily slow you down.
Exactly. And if you're looking at the changes in muscle size, it's going to be relatively small to what people think. If I say I remember recently had a conversation with a runner, and they're like, I don't want massive traps, when I gave them an overhead press. And I was like, trust me, to get big traps, you'd be working for years to try and develop those.
And how does that change both muscle adaptation and also bone adaptation as we age? Do you suggest anything different for older athletes?
Yeah, I mean, for the masters athlete, if you're 35 or above, which I'm now 35, so I'm classed as a masters runner, we do see differences in terms of injuries. So great research from Rich Willie and Max Paquette over in Canada. They've done some research on the masters athlete, and we do see differences. So for younger runners, we would tend to see more things like muscle strains, medial tibial stress syndrome, bone-related injuries. For masters runners, we tend to see more soft tissue, i.e. tendon and muscle. So that's because as we get older, naturally we have sarcopenia, we reduce, our muscle mass reduces, and also lifestyle, right? When get older, you end up having a family, your career, and lifestyle factors also contribute. So it's even more important for masters athletes to be focusing on their strength training. I've had one guy came into me about 12 months ago now, and he was dealing with really bad plantar heel pain underneath the heel. And he stopped strength training because he thought, I didn't want to get injured. He felt a bit vulnerable because he's like, I'm getting older, and if you look out there, the perception is, you don't want to be lifting weights as you're getting older. It's the opposite. So what I got him doing was slowly over time, just letting him, kind of educating him about the benefits of it, got him doing plyometrics. He's lifting, this guy's 80 kilos. His calf raises now up to 40 kilos for 6 reps, and he's got no pain, and his calves are ultimately like springs. He's got that plyometric ability back, and we lose that stiffness in our tendons as we get older. Therefore, we reduce our stride length. So we want to be working on improving leg strength, improving leg stiffness in order to reduce risk of injury and also maintain performance.
And that's also important in people as they get older, even if they're not runners or do any sports, right?
Yeah, so if you look at the other extreme, one of the big things as we get older is risk of falls goes up. And if we want to reduce risk of falls, strength training, increased protein intake, etc., all of these things provide massive benefits. And when you look at other research, I don't know this as in-depth as I do some of the running-related research, but we see those people who strength train tend to live a bit longer. It will reduce the risk of all-cause mortality, which also, I think sometimes for masters runners, you can get a bit of a negative rep in the media where you think, you shouldn't be running, you're older. We see running will significantly reduce all-cause mortality. We all know, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, we're all going to die, right, at some point, but in terms of relative risk to those who don't run, and same thing when it comes to things like osteoarthritis, or people say, running's bad for your knees, you shouldn't be pounding the pavement. Again, we see recreation runners will have significantly less risk of osteoarthritis than those who don't run.
And surely just healthier. I mean,
Yeah.
it's got to be better than sitting on your ass all day.
Absolutely. There you go. Absolutely. Yeah. So sedentary, your increase in BMI, increase in, cardiovascular risk goes up. So yeah.
I'll take a knee niggle any day. So you've mentioned so much really interesting research today. Is there something you've read recently which has really surprised you or changed the way you've thought about it? And this question comes because I feel like in the physio world, we're still understanding so much.
Yeah.
The advice and the research is changing all the time, and the human body is just fascinating. So what have you learned that's surprised you?
What surprised me is, there's been lots of things that surprised me. I think, because we spoke a lot about bones, I think the research around bones, we're starting to learn more about it. There's still much more that we need to know. But I think it really is coming down to understanding how training intensity, not only bones, but with other soft tissue injuries, can cause a big risk. So what I would love for people to kind of go away and think about is, do you understand your training intensities? Do you understand when you're running easy? Are you running easy, or are you actually, running above 80% of your maximum heart rate? And if you're looking at like easy zone 1 training, we're looking at below 80% of your maximum heart rate. But also what happens is, as we're running slower, magnitude of loading is less. As we run faster, magnitude of loading goes higher. So if you've got a runner that is, let's say, doing 60K a week, and they perceive that most of that is easy, but if you actually look at it, they're probably ending up in that middle zone. And in that middle zone is where, your tendons are going to get loaded a little bit more, your bones are going to get loaded a little bit more. And then often when it comes to speed sessions, they're struggling because they've been doing those easy sessions maybe a bit too hard. So it's understand your training intensity, be disciplined. It's not, and this is one thing that I struggle with, and I'll hold my hands up. I feel relatively fit at the moment, and I went out and I ran the other day and said, I'm going to go easy. And it wasn't. And I come back and I'm thinking, God, it's actually, you need a lot of discipline to do it.
Yeah, that actually links to something that I always think is interesting when someone is a specialist in a field. Do you follow all of your own advice? So is there anything that you tell your clients to do that you struggle to do yourself?
There'll be other people that know me well now will say pretty much everything. Because I require accountability. Everyone has different personality types. So I require to go and see someone to help me with certain injuries. I am getting better. And I think the more I've been running, the more I've learned how my body works. And I think that's a really good thing for runners, is ye guys will both know your bodies really well. Rose, we had a really interesting chat earlier about, the difference between someone being obsessively passionate about running or someone who just wants to achieve their goals. So for me, it is, I will tend to do my easy runs a bit too hard. That's one thing. Also, I would say to runners, have good variation in footwear. Don't feel like you always need to go into one shoe. At the moment, I'm really struggling to get out of one pair of shoes. So yeah, there's lots of things I need to develop as a runner, but that's the enjoyment of it. We're always learning, we're always evolving, and I learn a lot. I've learned a huge amount from both of you guys. I'm always asking you questions about intensity. Like, asked Rose a question about an Achilles injury and previous thing that she experienced, and it's helped me massively. So maybe I'll come on and I'll be on the other side of the couch and I'll ask you questions the next time.
I think that's an eternal problem for runners, isn't it? It's so easy to give advice, and we all know what we should be doing sensibly and in a lot of respects, but sometimes it's so hard to follow it when you just want to go for a run. And
it is.
I'm in that situation now with building up sensibly and just having to be so strict with it. But again, that's where accountability comes in, and just having someone to report to. And then if you have to go and tell them that you've done it wrong, you feel bad. So
yeah. So I'll hold you accountable.
Well, Aidan, thank you so much again for joining us for the 4th time. It's just, I think there's just endless topics that we can speak about. So no doubt you'll be back again at some point soon. But thank you so much for answering all of our questions. And I'm sure the listeners have found it very, very useful.
My pleasure. Always happy to come back on.
Thanks for joining us for 5 Miles Easy.
See you next time.